Welcome along, fellow Beatle people. This is the Beatle People Podcast. As you know, I've written a bunch of books and have produced a lot of videos and documentaries about the homes of the Beatles and other luminaries. And I am going to continue with part 2 of reading my book, Friar Park, A Pictorial History. Before I begin, please like, share, and subscribe to the Beatle People Podcast on whatever platform you are listening on. Now please join me around the campfire. So where we left off on part 1 was I read the first page about the house. It was kind of a grand overview and it was on page 35. So I'm going to go ahead and read about the south side of the mansion. And then I will talk about the east side of the mansion. And then you can hear me turn the pages here. North side, and then the west side, and then the view from Friar Park. Then I'm going to talk about the gardens a little bit. And let's see. Get into the Topiary Garden, and I think that's it for this time around. Yeah, and then we'll get into the rest of it another time. The entire book is 115 pages, so yeah, I think we'll go ahead and tackle this part now, and then there will be a part 3. Alrighty, and it starts off with a colorized image of the south side of the mansion, and the text is as follows. This spectacular view of the house from the south side is the initial impression during the approach from the winding driveway. The exterior walls at the south side of the house are covered with sculptures of gargoyles, grotesques, designs, riddles, puzzles, and inscriptions. High over the center of the gable is a seated friar with arms crossed over his breast in the motion of blessing the visitor. And then over the south entrance, visitors are welcomed by a pilgrim friar, and on one side of the words that translates to, "You are come most welcomely." And on the other side are words that translates to, "Go away, soon to return." And then there are 2 boot scrapers. And I don't think that George Harrison ever got those. It would be interesting to find out. But the 2 scrapers with brushes are each decorated with friars bearing cat-o'-nine nails. Actually, there's a little typo in the book. Sorry about that. As a reminder to those who do not wipe their feet before entering. And at the sides of the doors are statues of 2 friars, one representing the narrow way, and the other one representing the broad way. And then there is an electric bell, operated by a movable piece of malachite in the mouth of a marble friar's head. I would love to see that. Danny, if you are listening, and you ever do a documentary about Friar Park, can you please show the doorbell? That would be awesome. Turning the page, I have an interesting illustration that was from Sir Frank Crisp's book, showing a friar and the devil. And it says, to the west of the porch are carved busts of a friar and Satan. The friar had evidently started to exorcise the latter with bell, book, and candle, but the devil, having secured the bell and candle, is defying the exorcising, though the friar is still trying the effect of the book alone. Something tells me that probably wouldn't work. The book shows the diabolic magic square of 9, the figures of which make 9 in every straight line. On the devil's shoulder is a magpie, which was believed to be the devil's own bird, a belief which is, no doubt, the reason of the well-known injunction, quote, always take off your hat to a magpie, end quote. And then turning the page, we've got the mural sundial. This is pretty cool. This is just to the right of the main entryway to the mansion. And this is pretty cool. This is the mural sundial on the southeast corner of the south facade to the east of the front entry includes the motto, which translates to, shadows we are, and like shadows we depart, which is illustrated by the friar at the bottom pointing to his shadow, while at the opposite corner his gown alone is seen, the friar himself having departed. And then you've got the rays of the sun, which was created after a sculpture from 523 BC. They terminate in hands, some with the ankh, or cross with a handle, the Egyptian symbol of life. At the upper corners are figures of a friar and of time, the gun indicating that the friar is killing time. At the lower corner is a cock proclaiming sunrise. At the opposite corner are dandelions, with the heads partly blown off, a method in vogue, quote, when life was young, end quote, for finding what's a clock. A table of the equation of time shows the minutes that the clock is slower or faster than the sun. A hare illustrates the fast and a tortoise the slow. The 4 seasons are denoted by the primrose, rose, wheat, and ivy, with a butterfly for the sunny times the dial requires. Okay, let's talk about the east side of the mansion. And the text is as follows. With the advent and improvements of portable cameras being made available, Friar Park became a favorite location for photographers in the late 19th and early 20th century. Many black and white and colorized photos were distributed by publishers on postcards. In addition, Friar Park was a popular place for artists to illustrate Friar Park's buildings and gardens. Sometimes it is difficult to determine which images were original works of art or colorized images. This image, here on this page here, 41, shows the east side of the house as viewed from the lawn. Among the east-facing rooms on the ground floor are the dining room, study room, and drawing rooms. One of which, by the way, George and Patty turned into a third kitchen for themselves. They had a large kitchen that was there that the Crisp family used, and then they had the second one that they created in a space on the top floor above where the recording studio would be, and then they have this other one made. And turn the page, we have some cool vintage postcards of the east side of the mansion, and then you have information on the sculpture of the coins over the windows. And then the north side, it's not easy to get good images of the north side of the mansion, but there are these carvings there on the north facade of the house of friars representing the different winds. So you got the north wind, which is blustering, the east wind, which is piercing, the west wind, which is watery, and the south wind, smiling and sunny. Because of its proximity to the kitchen garden, the west side was designed to provide the entry to the scullery. And there is a sculpture that depicts a friar washing up dishes, flanked by a skull and crossbones on one side, and a pair of kitchen utensils on the other. The carvings for the kitchen entry offers culinary proverbs such as, quote, "God sends the meat, but the devil sends the cook," end quote. The proverb on the wall to the north is not, "Too many cooks spoil the broth," but its Latin equivalent, "perished through a crowd of doctors." And then I've got some images that show the view from Friar Park, which is pretty incredible. Friar Park is located on an east-facing hillside 270 feet above sea level on the west side of the Thames, and offers unrivaled views of the southern end of the Chiltern Hills and the grounds of Henley Park on the northern side of Friar Mile. Okay, let's talk about the gardens. So we've got an image from Thomas Hill's Gardener's Labyrinth, which depicts the layout of beds in 2 identical divisions of 4 sets each. See, what Frank Crisp used to do is find vintage images of gardens, and then he would show them to his gardeners and ask them to recreate them. And then he would show them to his gardeners and ask them to recreate them for Friar Park. At the bottom of page 51 is a colorized image of the Elizabethan herb garden. Like many of the other gardens at Friar Park, Sir Frank Crisp was inspired by illustrations from well-known and respected books about gardening. The herb garden is based on illustration from The Gardener's Labyrinth, written by Thomas Hill, using the pseudonym Didymus Mountain. During Crisp's time, you try saying that, the herb garden featured beds raised above the ground with sides of wooden boards, and a planting style based on engravings by Crispin de Passe. In the lower section of the garden, 34 medicinal herbs were planted, while 34 medicinal flowers were planted in the upper section. Sir Frank explained that the flowers were grown for their use in medicine and not for their beauty. Sir Frank's gardeners arranged numerous trellises and arbors around the grounds of Friar Park. I have an image of a wire archway that formed a cross with a dome in the center and was covered with honeysuckles, clematis, montana, roses, and Turner's Crimson Rambler. I then have a cool photo that I had colorized, and the text is, "This wigwam was originally covered with Crimson Rambler rose. The entrance was visible from the east side of the house. It was designed to provide an area for people to rest from their walks through the garden and to seek shelter from the sun and any inclement weather." And then on the top right-hand corner of the next page, it says, "This notice found near the gate was intentionally submitted for the earlier one of 'The grass may be walked upon,' in the expectation of meeting with an interesting psychological study. This expectation was duly fulfilled, as numerous visitors have puzzled over the notice and have even returned to the gates to inquire of the attendant whether the grass might or might not be walked upon. An analysis of the cause of this perplexity leads as a result to the conclusion that it is the concealed double negative that is the confusing element. A single negative is, of course, easily comprehensible, and a double negative, when openly expressed, is in the same position. Everyone recalling the school lesson that 2 negatives makes an affirmative. But here, the additional negative to the don't is concealed in the words keep off, which are really negative in character, though apparently not so in form. As in the case of Columbus and the egg, however, the real meaning in such a case is found in the simplest possible fashion. The meaning of an injunction to keep off the grass is obvious enough, and when to the prohibition of don't, it is equally obvious that the original injunction is cancelled or reversed. I didn't write that, by the way. Frank Crisp wrote that from his visitor's guide, and that's word for word from the visitor's guide in 1914. So yeah, the sign says, don't keep off the grass. And then there's a nice photo below that I had colorized, and the text is, the Garden of Sweet Smells and Saviors is a picturesque garden with brick-facing terraces in the form of concentric horseshoes, containing a collection of nearly 200 plants whose leaves are odoriferous, fair and foul. And then I've got an etching of the terrace garden at Friar Park and a little bit of information on Henry Ernest Miller, who was a landscape gardener and civil engineer in the UK during the late 19th century. Milner designed gardens in England, Scotland, Denmark, and Sweden, and was the author of the popular book, The Art and Practice of Landscape Gardening. The cultivated, geometrical, and symmetrical garden to the east of the house has been referred to as the terrace garden and as a Dutch garden. It has formal beds with dwarf shrubs, densely planted in scroll forms. And Crisp had violas blooming in the winter and colorful bedding plants blooming in the spring and summer. On the eastern edge is a water fountain that has been referred to as Ye Fountain of Perpetual Mirth. So it was named that long before George Harrison acquired Friar Park. Alright, let's talk about the Topiary Garden, and then I'll read some of the sundial inscriptions, and that'll be the end of part 2. So let's go ahead and finish up with the Topiary Garden. On the north side of the property, Frank Crisp created a topiary garden that included a collection of evergreen specimens with foliage and twigs clipped into geometric and fanciful designs. The trees were planted in the lawn and crossed by gravel paths, and laid out according to the plan of the labyrinth at Versailles. But instead of fountains, Crisp put in a unique collection of over 3 dozen vintage sundials. For those who don't know, the village of Versailles was a hedge maze in the Garden of Versailles with groups of fountains and sculptures depicting a series of fables. It was initially planned as a maze of unadorned paths in 1665, but in 1669, Charles Perrault advised Louis XIV to include 39 fountains, each representing one of the fables. In the illustration, there was a very fine specimen of a spirally trained tree and 2 representations of sheep. In the whole collection, there are endless varieties of shapes, such for instance as afternoon tea tables, peacocks, presentation cups, columns, pyramids, and ovals. There are excellent specimens of standard plants that are worked up 5 feet high. The shape of the tree thus worked resembles that of an umbrella. Then I have another illustration. It says, a pinetum that includes about 100 varieties of conifers have been formed. A collection of conifers also that have been trained and cut into endless, imitative, and fantastic shapes, and interspersed with a unique collection of old sundials from all sorts of sources. When topiary gardens became fashionable again in England during the mid to late 1800s, Frank Crisp was on the forefront of the movement. Among the closely clipped sculpture trees and old sundials in the topiary garden, Frank Crisp added a selection of decorative stone busts, urns, podiums, as well as an armillary sphere to contribute to the charm of his well-maintained and manicured garden. One of the most curious objects in the garden is the clipped yew, which appears to be climbing round a pole, after the manner of an ordinary climbing plant. The effect, however, has been produced by cutting away the plant from its stem in places. Okay, let's talk about the sundials. This is an excerpt from an article from the Gardener's Chronicle in 1899. It's as follows. What a change there is from the garden just described to that of the old English garden, full of conifers and other trees trained in imitative and grotesque shapes, and interspersed with old and curious sundials. The latter are perhaps more remarkable than the trees, for it is doubtful if a larger collection exists. One of these bears the date 1657. Another one, apparently very old, consists of a stone slab supported by an American eagle, whilst a third is said to be made from a piece of old London Bridge. So one of the sundials has the following engraving. A dial is the anatomy of the day, and a scale of miles for the journey of the sun. Another said, punctuality is the thief of time. Another said, the sundial stood as the garden god of Christian gardens. It spoke of moderate labors, of pleasure, not protracted after sunset. Another said, what a dead thing is a clock, compared with the simple, altar-like structure and silent heart language of the old dial. Another said, the sundial was so aged, it had gathered a thoughtful grace. And yet another said, methinks it were a happy life to carve out dials quaintly, point by point. Okay, I was going to end there, but I think I'll go ahead and end it by talking about the Japanese garden, which is probably my favorite garden at Friar Park. So let me go ahead and read that. On page 65, it says, Japanese gardens became fashionable in 19th century England. One of the best examples was created on the grounds of Friar Park in 1906, where it was located in a small valley to the south, overlooking the lower lake. There is a cascade on a rock face on the south side beneath a tea house. Plantings feature Japanese maples, bright golden yellow clipped yews, wisteria, bonsai trees, pruned shrubs, and a grouping of Siberian irises that were planted by the waterside. It also incorporated oriental elements such as stone lanterns, as well as stone and arched wood bridges. And then I've got the illustration that was used to recreate the Japanese garden at Friar Park. And the text is as follows. This illustration, by Josiah Condor, from his 1893 book, Landscape Gardening in Japan, inspired the design of Friar Park's Japanese garden. As mentioned by Crisp in his visitor's guide, the author's picture of a hill garden, Finnish style, will be seen that all its leading features are present in the Friar Park garden. The hills, the waterfall, the lake with its bridges, the lanterns, the trees, the stones, the well, and the position of all of which have to the Japanese a deep significance. Turning the page, on page 66, the text is as follows. Lanterns form an important feature of all Japanese gardens, their primary use not being to illuminate the gardens, but to form architectural ornaments. Even when occasionally lighted, the object seems to be rather the production of a dim and mysterious glow than to render objects distinctly visible. The class known as legged lanterns have the alternate name of snow scene lanterns, at the very wide umbrella-shaped roof or cap by which they are invariably covered makes a broad surface for snow to rest upon. And then at the bottom of the page I have a really great photo of the Japanese garden at Friar Park, circa 1906. The text is as follows. As to flowers, it must be pointed out that Japanese gardens are not flower gardens, whilst to us it seems impossible that a garden without flowers could be a thing of beauty. Yet, strange as it may appear to Western ideas, flowers, for their own sake, do not enter into the scheme of Japanese gardening. The gardener in Japan is not a cultivator of flowers, but a garden artist. Well, that sounds nice. And then on page 67 will be the end of the discussion on the Japanese garden at Friar Park. The text is as follows. This photo was clearly taken before the hills were covered with green grass. Friar Park's Japanese garden incorporated a hill garden into its design. As mentioned by Crisp, quote, of the 5 hills, number 1, the near mountain, represents a mountain of considerable size and has broad, sweeping sides. It has a pathway near its base, and the cascade has been arranged just in front of it. The adjacent hill, number 2, which is the companion mountain, is somewhat lower and of secondary importance. On the opposite side of the first hill, near the base of its broad slope, and somewhat more in the foreground, is placed hill number 3, Mountain Spur. Hill number 4, Near Hill, is a small, low, rounded eminence introduced in the near garden, having none of the characteristics of a large or distant mountain. Furthest off is hill number 5, the distant peak. It is steep in form and partially hidden below with little or no detail upon it, as it is meant to represent a distant peak in mountain scenery. And that's from the Visitor's Guide in 1914. Well, as you can imagine, this would be a lot easier if you were able to see the images that are in the book, so you might want to go out and buy the book. But as I mentioned, people are always asking me to read my books, and so that's what I'm doing right here for the Beatle People podcast, which will continue to evolve over time with all sorts of different ideas and different types of shows. And so this concludes this episode of the Beatle People podcast. What do you think of Friar Park? If you're rolling in dough, would you live in a place like that? And would you love to spend time strolling through all those incredible gardens? You know I would. Please like and share and subscribe to the show on whatever platform you are listening on. Until next time, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.